Hi, I'm Paul Lynde. Well, somebody had to be.
The Paul Lynde Halloween Special is one of the strangest hours of television ever broadcast. A witchy fever dream of celebrities, songs, and sensuality. At any moment, you might see a cameo by the Golden Girls' Betty White.
Goodbye, booby.
Or the Wicked Witch of the West and her sister looking for a party.
We want to go to a Hollywood disco.
And musical numbers by Mrs. Carol Brady and an up-and-coming band of youngsters called Kiss in their first primetime TV appearance.
Well, just what I've always wanted. 4 kisses on the first date.
And at the center of it all is comedian Paul Lynde.
Who's responsible for this?
Paul was famous for his recurring role as Uncle Arthur on Bewitched, for stealing the show in the musical Bye Bye Birdie, and for his not-too-subtle innuendo on Hollywood squares.
Paul, true or false, studies at the University of Wisconsin show that you'll probably live longer if you love only one man or woman at a time.
But it is all right to alternate.
By the mid-1970s, Paul was known for humor that skewed adult, a persona based around being annoyed by children, and a string of failed sitcom pilots. So of all the people to host a Halloween special...
Why, Paul Lynde?
Hey, I'm Matt, I make videos about pop culture, and this time I want to tell you the story behind the Paul Lynde Halloween Special, a truly hypnotic TV artifact. Why did this get made? How did this get made? And who was the man at the center of it all?
It's partially my fault.
So picture it, October 1976. For weeks, ABC has been promoting a new Halloween special. You turn on the TV on Friday, October 29, and witness this.
What's the matter, Margaret? Jack Frost nipping at your nose?
We meet our host, Paul, and his housekeeper, played by Margaret Hamilton, who was the Wicked Witch in The Wizard of Oz.
It's not Christmas.
Why don't you go dust?
Paul does some bits where he doesn't know what holiday it is.
Don't tell me. It's not Easter. Margaret, go prune a tree.
Culminating in him singing to a box of chocolates.
Sweet comic Valentine.
Then we go into a song and dance inspired by his signature number from Bye Bye Birdie, with the lyrics adjusted to promote ABC's TV lineup.
Kids with their silly sweat hogs and funky fawns.
Audiences of the time would have recognized all this as the setup for a pretty standard musical comedy variety show, which was a super popular genre at the time. There were hit variety shows for Sonny and Cher, The Brady Bunch, even Mary Tyler Moore. The Osmonds had a variety show that featured frequent guest appearances by Paul.
I'll be seeing ya, sweetie!
But this special soon takes a surreal twist. After the first commercial break, it suddenly switches to sitcom format, with the story about Paul and Margaret visiting a haunted house.
Won't you come in?
What's my second choice?
Then the sitcom format turns out to be a framing device for sketch comedy, with segments where Paul plays a butch trucker and romantic desert prince.
I'm turning myself on.
Every commercial break, the show transforms into something new. But the one thing that unites it all is Paul Lynde and his constant stream of quips.
You held a beauty contest and had a winner?
There's a lot to say about this Halloween special, but before we dig in, let's talk a little bit about who Paul Lynde was and how he ended up here. Here's how the website Queerty described Paul a decade ago in a post entitled, "Happy Birthday to Paul Lynde, History's Greatest Monster."
Possessed of a quick wit on camera and a seething rage behind the scenes, Paul inhabited roles that ranged from emasculated sniveler to flop-sweating gimmick and occasionally mincing pervert. He also played a garbage-dwelling rat who gorges himself on food and alcohol to the point of near catatonia. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, Charlotte the Spider tells the character. The Paul Lynde Halloween Special is possibly his most watchable endeavor by virtue of the incomprehensible coupling of Pinky Tuscadero, Margaret Hamilton, Florence Henderson, Betty White, and Kiss. His association with Donnie and Marie is nearly as hypnotic. He just wanted to get out of here, Donnie recalls. He hated it.
Yikes! Who would write something like that?
Who is it?
Who is it?
Who is it?
Who is it?
It's me.
10 years ago, I had just watched a bunch of Paul's performances, and I found myself getting irrationally angry. So angry that I wrote a hit piece about him on what would have been his birthday.
Why, it was revolting.
In hindsight, I don't think my birthday tribute tells the full story, so I want to talk a little more about Paul's life and how my thoughts have changed. Paul grew up in Mount Vernon, a small town with the motto, one of Ohio's most likable communities. He had 5 siblings, and even as a kid, he struggled with feelings of inadequacy.
There was 4 brothers, and he always listed them as Richard the athlete, Cordy the brain, Johnny the baby, and Paul the nothing.
That was Lynde's biographer, Paul Florensky, in the A&E doc Off Center. And although he felt overlooked, Paul had big dreams.
He really wanted to just be rich and famous, and he thought the only way he could do it was to become a movie star.
Friends recalled that he was embarrassed that his father was a butcher, and he would joke that he was actually a cattle surgeon. Paul used to sit on the steps of a local mansion and wave to passers-by like he owned it. He told one interviewer, "I guess I always had delusions of grandeur." Paul's self-consciousness would get even worse when he was 10. His appendix burst, and after surgery, he came down with peritonitis, a disease that back then was often fatal. He was bedridden for a year, and during that time, he gained over 100 pounds. When he returned to 5th grade, kids started teasing him. His friend Kathy Rudolph wrote in her biography of Paul, "As Paul walked to school, a few kids started to call him names, but Paul said something that cracked them up. He was relieved that they were laughing with him, not at him." Paul had discovered a special talent that he could use to cover up his insecurities. In Kathy's book, Paul's quoted as saying, "I made them laugh to distract them from my being fat."
He knew that he could use his weight for laughs.
This was around the time that Paul started to get serious about acting. Kathy writes that when he was on stage was the only time he truly felt noticed. As she says, not for his size, but for his talent.
When that opportunity came to go out on that stage, he loved it. You could just see that it was part of his makeup.
His parents didn't want him to pursue acting, but he was determined and headed to Northwestern, where he became one of the most popular students on campus. Here's his college friend, Cloris Leachman.
You wanted to be with Paul. You wanted to be around Paul.
From there, he headed to New York in 1949 with big Broadway dreams. He was part of a talented group of young performers. In addition to Cloris, he worked alongside Mel Brooks, Eartha Kitt, Maggie Smith, and Charlotte Rae.
Wow, what a lineup!
But New York was a lot tougher for him than Northwestern. At first, Paul struggled to make a name for himself and lived off of money that his parents sent. He'd only been in New York a few months when he got news that his brother, who had disappeared while fighting in World War II, was confirmed as having died in action. Within a month of receiving the news, his mother died of a heart attack. Paul told a reporter she died of a broken heart. 3 months later, his brother's remains returned to the US for burial, and Paul's father died the very next day. In a matter of months, Paul had lost a major part of his family, and also his financial support. For a time, he resorted to stealing food and selling blood to make ends meet. But then there was a stroke of luck. He entered an open mic talent contest, and the audience loved him. He got booked to return, and gradually he built up a name for himself as a comedian. In the early 50s, he appeared in a review of up-and-coming talent called New Faces that was so popular it got turned into a film. Here he is in one of his early performances, playing a witch, which oddly foreshadows his later career.
Happy Halloween! Just like our Christmas, isn't it, Ethel?
His big breakout came in 1960 in the Broadway show Bye Bye Birdie, where he plays an anxious father who's annoyed by kids today. Here he is in the movie version.
Kids! I don't know what's wrong with these kids today.
Off the success of that show, he moved to LA to pursue more film and TV. All his dreams of being a rich and famous star seemed to be coming true. Paul starred in 4 TV pilots in the 1960s. The first was 1962's Howie, where he plays a father who can't stand his daughter's new husband, an unemployed genius named Howie.
What is it?
It's Xochitl, the Aztec goddess of fertility.
It's beautiful!
Don't touch him.
Take a look at Paul's reaction here when he learns what Howie's father does for a living.
What does your father do, Howie?
He's a butcher in Eagle Rock, California.
Remember, Paul was a butcher's son. Howie was made to be a replacement for the Dick Van Dyke Show, which was about to be canceled, but at the last minute, Dick Van Dyke got renewed, and Howie never made it to air. Paul's first shot at a leading role ended before anyone even saw it. So he tried again with some more pilots. One was a show called Manly and the Mob, which was similar to Get Smart. Another was called Two's Company. Neither of those got picked up either. And just to add insult to injury, TV executives loved Paul's co-star in Two's Company, an up-and-coming actress named Marlo Thomas, and they created an entire series for her called That Girl, which ran for many years. Two's Company helped turn Marlo Thomas into a star, and Paul was left behind. His best chance at a leading role came in 1966 on a series with the amazing title Sedgwick Hawkstyle's Prince of Danger. Paul played a Victorian detective who's called upon whenever Sherlock Holmes is too busy. And unlike the other 3 pilots, this one actually got picked up and was scheduled to air. It looked like Paul would finally get his big break. After shooting the pilot, Paul needed a vacation, so he and a friend, an actor named Jim Davidson, took a trip up to San Francisco. Late at night, after some drinks, Jim fell 8 stories from a hotel room fire escape and died. The story goes that he and Paul had been horsing around and Jim tried to impress him by doing chin-ups.
He crawled out the window and then hung from the sill and tried to pull himself up, and he couldn't. And Paul tried to help him, but he slipped.
Paul was understandably traumatized by Jim's death, but he also panicked over what newspapers would say. Looking back on it years later, he said, I know it looked strange. He was younger than I was. He was good looking, and why was he there with me? That night, he said to himself, I've just ended my career. Police cleared him of any wrongdoing, but after the news broke, ABC didn't want to be associated with the incident.
ABC was worried about it. They were worried about Paul.
They pulled the series before it could air, and just when he was the closest he'd ever come to landing a starring role, his lifelong dream, it was gone. But although starring roles seemed to be always just beyond his grasp, there was another kind of role where Paul did great. During the 60s, he was a constant fixture on sitcoms and game shows and late night. His signature style was what I like to call the gay sniper. He'd pop up to deliver witty remarks and innuendo and then disappear.
Sergeant Ramsden, Royal Canadian Mounted Police. We always get our man.
Audiences loved him as Uncle Arthur on Bewitched.
Forgive me for not rising, but I'm up to my neck in work.
And on Hollywood Squares, where he could fire off one-liner after one-liner.
True or false, research indicates that Christopher Columbus liked to wear bloomers and long stockings.
Well, it's not easy to sign a crew up for 6 months.
Paul appeared on over 1,000 episodes of Hollywood Squares alone. He also appeared in a string of animated projects, including Charlotte's Web.
This will be a night to remember.
And in a Hungarian movie called Hugo the Hippo.
There are no sharks in the Sultan's harbor.
God heavens!
Paul appeared in a whole bunch of animated projects in the early 70s. For more about those, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/mattbaum. Anyway, by the early 1970s, Paul was quickly becoming one of the most popular actors in America. In one survey, viewers ranked him just behind Robert Redford and Katharine Hepburn. Imagine a rom-com with those three together.
I don't much like our children.
I don't know what's wrong with these kids today.
But he was also feeling increasingly insecure about his inability to land serious roles. At one point he said, "The more famous I become, the harder it is to stay on top. You're only as good as your last joke." He'd also started to engage in self-destructive drinking. He kept getting arrested for DUIs. His go-to move was trying to joke his way out of it by ordering a cheeseburger from the cop, which sometimes worked. But eventually his insurance got so expensive, he had to hire a chauffeur. During the worst of his drinking, he was excited for an opportunity to meet Hal Prince at a party. But when he finally got a chance to talk to the famous Broadway director, Paul just ended up insulting him. The next day, Paul was mortified. Here's his friend Dick Van Dyke describing what happened next.
So he called this woman and once again pleaded, "Please, I have got to make amends. You've got to let me make up to this man." So she did, had him back, and he did the same thing again. He did it, back him against the wall. He couldn't help himself.
As he headed into the 1970s, Paul felt a tremendous amount of pressure. Professionally, he kept losing out on the leading roles that he craved. And in his personal life, he had to remain closeted because if the public found out that he was gay, it could have destroyed his career. And then the pressure was going to get even worse. Bewitched, where he had one of his most stable and popular roles, was supposed to start its 9th season, but the star, Elizabeth Montgomery, was in the process of separating from her husband, producer William Asher, and neither one wanted to keep making the show. The problem was that they had a contract with ABC to keep the show going, so they came up with a compromise. They'd end Bewitched and create a new show starring Paul Lynde to replace it. But rather than come up with a new show from scratch, they resurrected Howie, the pilot from 10 years earlier, where Paul played a long-suffering suburban husband who hates his son-in-law. Once again, he was playing a buffoonish father, and he seemed less than enthusiastic about it. Here he is promoting the show on I've Got a Secret.
It's Ozzie and Harriet.
All over again.
Only this time I'm saying the lines. No, and I just hope a little better. No, there's nothing new
What do you
left.
play?
A father.
A father.
Yeah.
All right.
I know it's hard to believe.
We all have to go sometime. All right. Well, Paul, if you'll whisper your secret to me, we'll show the audience what it is.
By the way, the one in hysterics is Pat Carroll, who played Ursula the Sea Witch. He just can't get away from witches. After 4 failed pilots, the Paul Lynde Show debuted in 1972. It reuses a lot of the material from the first attempt.
What is it?
It's Xochitl, the Aztec goddess of fertility.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Don't touch him. What does your father do?
He's a butcher in Eagle Rock, California.
Butcher.
They attempted to modernize it a bit by having Paul go to a dirty movie.
What are you doing here? Same as you. Only I'm not taking notes.
And the show hints that Paul as a married man might seem a little far-fetched.
Sex is not for housewives.
I've noticed that lately.
So, how'd it go?
It was a huge rating the first week. People hated it. The second week, the rating, phew.
That was Paul's frequent collaborator, writer Bruce Vilanch. The Paul Lynde Show lasted for only a few months, and then it became failed series number 5 for Paul. This was all happening as many of the other performers that he'd come up with were gaining huge fame. Mel Brooks was making movies, Eartha Kitt was an international star, Cloris Leachman was starring in a sitcom of her own, Maggie Smith had won an Oscar, and then there's Paul, yearning for lead roles, but loved for his clownery.
Even though you're only make-believing, laugh, clown, laugh.
See, when you do clownery, the clown comes back to bite.
Meanwhile, even though the pilot had failed, he still had a contract to appear on ABC in some form. So, after one more attempt at a lead role on a show called Temperatures Rising, ABC decided to burn off the contract by putting him on a bunch of variety shows and specials. On one hand, that was a great deal for Paul, who got paid a starring rate for every guest appearance. But on the other hand, it led to some very strange television.
You turkeys call yourself gladiators.
I string necklaces out of crab legs.
As lucrative as they may have been, these guest spots were not the leading roles that Paul wanted. And that brings us to 1976. Executives at ABC were looking for ways to finish out Paul's contract. Fred Silverman, the head of the network, came up with the idea of pairing Paul and Halloween, because
there's something essentially witchy about Paul Lynde.
Tally-ho!
So they decided to put him on a Halloween special and hired some famous witches to appear alongside him. One was Margaret Hamilton from The Wizard of Oz.
I'm gonna love Halloween this year.
The other was Billy Hayes, who played Witchy Poo on HR Pufnstuf, and explaining that show would require a whole other video, but the short version is that it was a psychedelic children's program. Like Pufnstuf, the Halloween special is mind-altering in its own way. It starts with Paul hiding in a giant pumpkin.
Hi.
Then he launches into a self-deprecating monologue. He brings up his lifelong insecurity about his weight.
I was fat.
And then turns that insecurity into a joke about one of his first Halloween costumes.
And I went as the Hindenburg. It was a disaster.
That's followed by a little dance number that calls back to his hit movie.
There's too much Alice Cooper, not enough Alice Faye.
Then he's thrown into a trash can and blown up by Donnie and Marie. And emerges like Rita Repulsa.
There's something essentially witchy about Paul Lynde.
We're off to a fun start. When we come back from the break, Paul's going for a drive with Margaret, his housekeeper, to a haunted house. He meets her sister, Witchy Poo, and Miss Halloween, played by Betty White, who was promised a date with the famous Paul and is unimpressed with the one that she's received.
We'll meet again, Mr. Lynde, when you're somebody.
Margaret and Witchy Poo want Paul to help improve the public image of witches, and they offer him 3 wishes in exchange for his help. His first wish is to be a trucker, covered in glittering rhinestones.
These rhinestones are my trademark, and trucking is my game.
And with that, we're into a comedy sketch about Paul as a manly truck driver, trying to win the heart of a diner waitress played by Roz Kelly, who's here because she played Pinky Tuscadero on ABC's Happy Days. Paul wins her heart the old-fashioned way.
He may be the strongest and he may be the smartest, but I am the richest.
In this fantasy sequence, Paul plays the kind of leading man that he'd always dreamed of being. He's rich, he's famous, a masculine ideal. That is the most ambitious chest merkin I have ever seen. He also gets to be a romantic lead. But under it all, he's still Paul, with snide one-liners and a tight, sparkling outfit that looks like something from Liberace's spring collection. And even though the sketch ends with him marrying the girl in a big musical number, they don't even kiss. And in the background, you can see Tim Conway jumping into the arms of the preacher. This flamboyant take on truck driving is followed by a performance by Kiss, who arrive in an elevator like Dr. Frankenfurter. Look how excited Paul is.
Come on, Margaret, I've always wanted to meet Kiss.
Paul had no idea who they were.
I just want to note that when Paul was in Bye Bye Birdie, he played a character whose whole deal was that he didn't get the music of today's modern youth. And he's basically just become that.
Does your mother know what you're doing?
Then it's time for Paul's second wish. This time, he wants to be a rich and powerful sheik. In this sketch, he plans to seduce an English heiress, and the heiress, by the way, is played by Florence Henderson. That's Mrs. Brady from ABC's The Brady Bunch. I guess she just has a thing for gay husbands.
Why are you wearing that earring?
Because I'm a very chic.
This sketch is a parody of the lover character popularized by Rudolph Valentino in silent films of the 1920s, before Paul was even born. The same year that this aired, 1976, there were more gay characters than ever on TV. It had never been clear that the future of television included openly queer characters. And then here's Paul, not only playing it straight, but doing it with a trope from 50 years earlier. Paul never publicly acknowledged being part of the gay community, even going so far as to say that he didn't want gay fans because, quote, gay people killed Judy Garland, but they're not going to kill me. He was a little more open in private, saying among friends that Anita Bryant went after his people. Paul had several relationships with men, some serious enough that he had his license plate updated with his lover's name, Pablo, but on screen, he always played a husband and father and never discussed his personal life.
I mean, I think everybody knew, and if they didn't know just to meet him, once they sussed his living situation, they knew. I mean, there was always some, cute guy named Chad standing around holding a martini glass.
So following the Chic sketch, we get some musical numbers. First up, Mrs. Brady takes the balcony like Cersei Lannister.
That old black magic has me in its spell.
Then we get a power ballad from Kiss.
Me and the boys are playing.
And finally, a song called Disco Baby, which I think might be about the Ally McBeal baby going to the disco.
Move it in, move it out, move it in and about, disco baby.
Or on second thought, maybe it's just a dirty version of the Hokey Pokey. When this aired, disco had been gaining popularity for the last couple years and was increasingly associated with gay culture, which would later lead to a backlash like the Disco Sucks movement. But at least, for now, it was the most openly gay thing Paul does in the entire special.
I like that funky stuff.
Meanwhile, character actor Billy Barty puts in a brief appearance, then wanders off.
I think I'll go make a pizza.
That is how I want to leave every room from now on. As the party comes to a close, Paul has some final thoughts that at first sound a little strange.
In case I don't see you for a while, to all you little monsters out there, you have a happy Halloween.
In case I don't see you for a while. He makes it sound like he's going into hiding. It's a strange way to end a show, but then again, over the last decade and a half, he'd bombed on multiple TV pilots. Aside from occasional guest appearances, he probably knew that leading man opportunities wouldn't be coming his way again soon. And among his parting words to viewers,
thank you for making me feel wanted.
It's honestly touching. After failing to land those leading roles and seeing his peers achieve greater success, I can understand why Paul might feel unwanted. This message at the end is for everyone who'd stayed with this weird show all the way through, knowing at least those people wanted what he had to offer. I can see how that would feel validating. But while it may sound like he's saying goodbye, this wasn't the end of Paul's story. After this aired, Paul kept doing variety shows, including an appearance as a witch on Donnie and Marie's show.
I must have the shoes.
He also stuck around on Hollywood Squares, where his gift really shone. He was such a master of the one-liner that they eventually gave him top billing with the host and doubled his salary. And heading into the late 70s, when TV could be a bit more bold about sexuality, now and then the quips would at least hint about him being gay.
Who's generally better looking, a fairy or a pixie?
Looks aren't everything.
But he still never came out, even though he wanted to. Here's his friend Kay Ballard.
He would have loved to have come out. They knew he was anyway, but I think he could have been the first to really score.
Over the summers, Paul often appeared in touring theatrical productions, and that brings me to the clip that made me write that irrationally angry article about him a decade ago. It was 2 years after the Halloween Special aired, in July of 1978, and Paul was in Toledo, Ohio, appearing for a week in the play The Impossible Years. It was a light comedic role that he'd been performing for a decade, another frazzled father, and to promote it, he dropped by the local TV news station. Must have been a slow news day, because someone had the idea that he should do the weather report.
We brought in an expert, Paul Lynde, who has been following weather for some time, I understand.
Yes. I love picnics.
Paul seems a little baffled by the whole thing. He has no idea how to read the maps.
What does that mean? Oh, what did that mean?
He doesn't know where to stand.
No, do I go to this now?
Yeah.
All right, okay.
He gets tangled in the microphone.
I'll pull down your set.
And he even seems to break part of the set and swear under his breath.
They what?
I first saw this clip 10 years ago when an editor asked me to write about Paul Lynde's 86th birthday, and to me it felt incredibly uncomfortable. What I saw was a gay man struggling to perform. I thought the crew's laughter sounded like pity laughs. I felt embarrassed on his behalf. And it filled me with rage because I thought that he was making gay people look bad.
Cringe.
Why? Well, to put it simply, I was projecting. I felt like a flop. I felt pathetic. I felt like a gay joke. Around the time I saw this clip, I had just left a good stable job to write full-time for a startup, and I was almost immediately fired. I was struggling in my own work, and around the time I saw Paul struggling through this appearance, he became the vessel for my self-loathing. I was like the high school bully who goes after a gay kid because he sees something of himself in his target and he doesn't like it. But there's a lot about Paul that I was missing, and I see him in a very different light now. When I look back at this clip today, I don't feel angry anymore. Instead, I feel regret about how mean I was in that post, especially when I think about how it would make his loved ones feel to read it. Knowing now how he struggled with addiction and how unhappy he was about his weight, I feel terrible about comparing him to the rat who gorged himself to near catatonia. And I feel especially bad about using words like emasculated and mincing to insult him. I really regret putting my own internalized homophobia out into the world. The more I learn about Paul, the more I feel empathy with him, especially when it comes to how critical he was of himself.
And I'm just absolutely scared of coming out and being myself.
Oh, come on now.
I also feel an appreciation for everything that he achieved. Looking at his work now, I see a kid who learned to use comedy to cope with his insecurities, who moved away from his small town to a big city, only to lose a sibling and both parents in the span of a couple months. I see a performer who longed for respect and saw one opportunity after another slip through his fingers, even as his peers climbed to fame. And I see all of his triumphs. Paul persevered through insecurities, through self-sabotage and tragedies to carve out a career for himself, becoming one of the most popular actors in the country at a time when audiences were likely to reject anything that was even remotely identifiable as queer. He dreamed his whole life of entertaining millions and succeeded, even if it wasn't the kind of success that he'd envisioned. When I look back at this clip, I see a lot that I missed 10 years ago. There's the fact that even in this awkward format, he's still able to make the crew laugh.
It looks like I'm gonna be a fortune teller.
And that he's able to get away with some pretty daring jokes.
And 69. You know, I have a niece that lives up there. Happy 69.
And that everybody in the room is having a great time.
Voters forecast. Oh, screw them. Sunrise.
I'd rather be one of the people who are laughing and having a great time than cringing and criticizing. And to be honest, what I feel now is envy. I look at everything Paul achieved, and I wish I was more like him. He set out to become an entertainer despite his insecurities and his parents not wanting him to pursue acting, and he made his dreams come true. He was rich and famous and successful. Next year, it'll be 40 years since he died, but we're still talking about him, still enjoying his work, even the weird specials like this one, because there was nobody else who was as good as he was at what he did. Here's Bruce Valanche talking about Paul on Gilbert Gottfried's podcast a few years ago.
If he thought that we would be talking about him, he would be stunned, because in his mind he hadn't made it. He hadn't done anything. He'd made money, but he hadn't become an icon, that figure. And
now he is.
He would be absolutely amazed.
So, happy Halloween to Paul Lynde, TV's witchiest gay uncle.
Gee, I'm all choked up.
By the way, making this video, I came across a lot of great stories that I didn't have room for in the script, like Paul's awkward interactions with Marlon Brando, his later collaborations with Elizabeth Montgomery after Bewitched, and how McDonald's stole the character of Grimace from the Wicked Witch's sister. Check out my Patreon for those stories at patreon.com/mattbaum. And now, if you'll excuse me, I must go commune with the night rat.
Rats! Anyone who's a friend of rats is a friend of mine.
Can the two of us need look no more?